as they spent so much time together. Indeed, it might even be imagined that they developed affection for each other. One of these boys, as I just said, was named Robert. The other was named George. There was every reason why they should not have had respect for each other. Robert was the son of the owner of the farm. George was the son of one of the workers. Robert was the scion of the master. George, the offspring of a slave. Robert was white. George was black. But despite it all, a bond of respect developed between these two young men. In June of 1861, Tennessee left the Union by declaring itself a free and independent state. Shortly afterward, Tennessee joined the Confederacy, the last state to leave the Union. Like so many other young men in this part of the state, Robert joined the Confederate Army and enlisted in the 17th Tennessee Volunteer Infantry. That unit assembled at Camp Harris on the banks of Elk River at the community we today call Estill Springs. Later they moved to Camp Trousdale near Clarksville, Tennessee. They would soon go into combat and they would fight at Fishing Springs, also called Mill Creek. They would see action around Corinth, Mississippi. They would march all the way into Kentucky to fight the Battle of Perryville in the autumn of 1862. Robert, by that time, had risen to the rank of lieutenant. When the regiment went to Kentucky, following Perryville, he was promoted to the rank of captain. As the Confederate forces shifted across from Kentucky to Murfreesboro, Robert wrote to his mother at Fairfield. He said, "Most of the servants have left the army and have gone home since we returned from Kentucky. I would like for George to come up here to Murfreesboro to do the washing and cooking for my mess, but I want him to come only if he wants to." A strange letter, I think, since Robert could have ordered George to come up to serve him, but a bond of respect had somehow grown up between the two, so Robert made this a request instead of an order. George had been at Murfreesboro only a few days when on December the 31st, 1862, 150 years ago this month, the battle began there along the banks of Stones River. The 17th Tennessee was in the thick of the battle. By nightfall, 22 of its 41 officers had been shot dead or wounded, along with over 200 of its enlisted men. Robert was among the officers who had been seriously wounded. In a hospital set up in the Soule Academy, Robert's right leg was amputated above the knee. The day Robert was shot, George took the officer's horse and rode back here to Fairfield. The next day, George drove a wagon carrying Robert's mother to Murfreesboro to nurse her son. George became her assistant in caring for Robert. On January 6, 1863, the Confederate Army retreated from Murfreesboro, and Bell Buckle became the front line. Courier City became the front line. This meant that George and Robert's mother stayed behind, and they became refugees now behind the lines of the United States Army. At last, in March, Robert was out of danger from his wound, but instead of being sent home as a permanently disabled soldier, he was sent to a prisoner of war camp. This was itself rather unusual. Generally, those who were permanently disabled were allowed to go home. But Robert went to a prisoner of war camp. George came back here to Fairfield with Robert's mother. Now please think for just a minute about what I just said. At Murfreesboro, George was a free man. The Emancipation Proclamation did not extend to the state of Tennessee. Tennessee was not covered by that document, but Army policy would have allowed George to choose his own future, to settle his own fate, and behave in every way as if he were indeed a free man. but he returned to Fairfield with Robert's mother. Respect for Robert and for his family seemed to have been a strong motivation, so as he returned to a place where legally he was still enslaved. In July of 1863, Union forces came down the railroad through this area, and Fairfield became a place far behind the fighting front. Now, George could act as his heart moved him to do so, and he enlisted in the 16th Regiment of what was known officially as the United States Colored Troops, the USCT. He was a good soldier. He worked hard, he followed the regulations, he used his intelligence, and he rose to the rank of sergeant, the highest rank the United States Army allowed African Americans to hold at that time. George went to a photographer in Shelbyville, and he had his portrait made wearing his dress uniform. Now time passed, and the war was over. Robert was released from the POW camp, which was in the harbor of Boston, Massachusetts, and he came back home. He had a farm, but it was devastated by the war. And even had it not been devastated by the war, he could not farm that land, for he had but one leg. In the late spring of 1865, George was discharged from the rank of sergeant in the United States Army. He had his health. He had a sound body, but he had no way to make a living. He knew how to farm, but he had no land. George came back to Fairfield. There he met Robert. George and Robert made a bargain. Robert would provide the land and the financial backing. George would recruit the workforce and would serve as foreman on the estate. The former master, the former slave, the ex-Confederate captain, the ex-Yankee sergeant, the white man and the African American still respected each other. George took the last name of Robert's family, calling himself for the rest of his life George Singleton. The two attended the same church. They worked together to make a living. Today, in the cemetery of New Hope Baptist Church at Fairfield, you will find the grave of Robert Singleton surrounded by his family, and nearby you will find the grave of George Singleton surrounded by his family. And each year, at the Singleton home, the two Singleton families, one white, one African American, meet to remember their ancestors who had respect for each other despite all that should have logically separated them. I learned this story from Mrs. Clara Singleton, the descendant of George and chairman of the trustees of the Montville College Foundation, and the rest of the story from Major General Robert Singleton, the descendant of Robert. In the story of George and Robert, and in the story of their descendants, there is a lesson of encouragement and a lesson of hope for us all. Respect, despite the things